The wind came off Lake Michigan like a blade that January night. It cut through the empty streets of Chicago's South Side, pushing trash across frozen sidewalks and rattling chain-link fences in the dark. Most folks in the city had already locked their doors against the cold, but not everyone had a door to lock. Beneath the concrete overhang of the I-90 expressway, where the shadows swallowed the last of the streetlight, a massive dog lay pressed against a woman's body on the frozen ground. The dog was a Neapolitan Mastiff, easily 130 pounds, with a broad wrinkled head and deep-set eyes that hadn't closed in hours. One of its front legs was wrapped in a strip of torn fabric, stained and crusted from an old wound. Its ribs showed through its dark coat, but the dog didn't move. It lay curled around the woman like a wall of muscle and bone, its body the only thing standing between her and the freezing air. The woman was young, though the cold and the hunger had aged her well beyond her years. Her coat was thin and torn at the elbows. Her boots were too large, stuffed with newspaper that had long since gone damp. Her lips had turned a shade of blue that didn't belong on the living. She wasn't moving, but she was breathing, barely, and every shallow breath sent a faint cloud of mist into the frozen dark. Around her left wrist, a hospital bracelet clung tight against the skin, faded but still readable, a baby's name printed across it. She hadn't taken it off in 12 months. Not once. The dog's ears shifted. Something was coming. A low rumble of an engine echoed down the empty street. Headlights appeared in the distance, slow, deliberate, cutting through the dark like two pale eyes. The dog lifted its massive head and stared toward the approaching light. A low growl began deep in its chest. It didn't bare its teeth yet, but every muscle in its body tightened. Whatever was coming, the dog had already decided one thing. Nothing was getting near this woman. The black Bentley rolled to a stop beneath the overpass. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out into the freezing air. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark suit that cost more than most people's rent. There was a faint trace of blood on his shirt cuff that he hadn't bothered to clean. His face showed nothing, no warmth, no hesitation. Just the calm, measured stillness of a man who was used to controlling everything around him. His name was Vincent Drago, and in this city, that name alone was enough to make grown men look away. He ran the Drago family, one of the most powerful organizations in Chicago's underworld, and he hadn't felt anything real in 5 years, not since the car bomb that took his wife and 3-year-old son on a Sunday morning. But tonight, as his eyes swept across the frozen ground beneath the overpass, something made him stop. The dog. He recognized it instantly. The broad skull, the heavy folds of skin, the dark brindle coat he'd know anywhere. Nero, his dog, the last gift his wife had ever given him, lost 3 weeks ago during a chase gone wrong. Vincent had sent men across the city searching. He'd offered money no stray dog should have been worth. And here Nero was, not wandering lost on some back street, but lying in the freezing dark, wrapped around a woman he'd never seen before, guarding her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Vincent took one step forward. Nero's growl deepened. The dog didn't wag its tail. It didn't come running. Instead, it pressed closer to the woman and bared its teeth at the man who'd raised it from a pup. Vincent stopped. He looked at the dog. Then he looked at the woman, her bluish lips, her shallow breathing, the hospital bracelet on her wrist. And for the first time in years, something stirred behind his ribs that he thought had turned to stone a long time ago. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But his dog, the only living thing he still trusted in this world, had chosen to freeze beside her rather than leave. And that changed everything. Because what Vincent Drago did next didn't just save her life. It cracked open something inside him he'd spent 5 years trying to bury. If this story's already pulling you in, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a good story tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that freezing night beneath the overpass, where a dog refused to leave, and a dangerous man had to decide what kind of person he still was. Vincent Drago stood there for a few more seconds, looking at the dog lying pressed tightly against the woman on the frozen concrete. Nero was still growling, but the sound had softened, as if the dog was weighing his instinct to protect against the memory of the hand that had once raised him. Vincent didn't try to move any closer. Instead, he took off his cashmere coat, slowly, each movement clear enough for the dog to see that he wasn't carrying any threat. He lowered one knee to the cold ground and laid the coat over the girl, gently drawing it across her shoulders, over her thin arms, over the hand still clenched tight even in unconsciousness. Nero watched every motion. When the coat had covered the girl completely, the dog sniffed the scent of cashmere, then lowered his head again and rested it back on her arm. He didn't leave, but he stopped baring his teeth. Vincent turned toward the Bentley and knocked twice on the car door. The front door opened. Henley Voss stepped out, nearly as tall as Vincent, his face hard as stone, his eyes sweeping over the scene in less than 2 seconds before he understood the situation. From the passenger seat, Paxton Drago stepped out as well. Vincent's younger brother, 3 years younger. The same height but with a softer face, not yet worn down by life to the point of losing all expression the way his older brother had. Paxton looked at the dog, then at the woman, then at Vincent. He didn't say anything, but one eyebrow tightened slightly. Vincent gave the order in a clipped voice. "Get them both into the car." Henley didn't ask questions. He stepped forward and crouched beside the girl. Nero lifted his head instantly, the growl returning at once, deeper now, more vicious. Henley stopped and looked toward Vincent, waiting for instruction. Vincent moved closer to Nero, not rushing, not forcing anything. He crouched about a step away from the dog and spoke softly, his voice for the first time that night carrying something close to gentleness. "Nero, it's me." The dog looked at him. Those deep-set eyes blinked slowly. His ears tilted slightly forward, where old memory was battling new instinct. Vincent didn't touch him. He simply stayed there in the cold, letting the dog decide for himself. A few seconds passed that felt as long as entire minutes. Then Nero let out a soft whine, the kind of sound only people who'd ever raised a dog could truly understand. Not surrender, but acceptance. He lowered his head, but stayed pressed against the girl, his body saying more clearly than words ever could that he wouldn't leave her, but he would allow these men to come near. Henley moved quickly but carefully. He lifted the girl into his arms, startlingly light for a man whose hands had once broken other people's bones. The girl gave a faint moan in his arms, but didn't wake. Her head lolled to one side. Her tangled hair stuck damply to her forehead. Nero rose at once and walked close beside them, his muzzle only inches from Henley's hand, ready to bite if necessary. Vincent opened the rear door of the car. Henley laid the girl onto the leather seat, lifted her head, and rested it on the coat that had been folded into a cushion. Nero jumped into the car right after that, without waiting for anyone to invite him, then lay down on the floor beneath the girl's feet, his massive head resting on her oversized shoes. Vincent sat down in the seat opposite her. The door closed. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the cold outside. Henley started the engine, and the Bentley glided forward along the empty road. Warm air from the heating system spread through the cabin. Vincent didn't look outside. He looked at the girl. In the dim light from the dashboard, he could see more clearly what the darkness had hidden. Her cheeks were hollow, her jawbone sharply visible beneath thin skin. There were old bruises on her right wrist, faded now into pale yellow, but still there, shaped like fingers. Someone had held this girl very tightly once, and not out of love. Then he saw the hospital bracelet on her left wrist. Thin white plastic, the edges worn, but the printed words could still be read beneath the light. Rosalie Brennan, date of birth, weight, hospital name, a child. This girl had a child somewhere. Vincent looked at the bracelet for one more second, then turned his face away. He didn't ask. There are questions a man like him knows shouldn't be asked until the other person is ready to answer them. Paxton looked at his brother through the rearview mirror. Then he turned slightly and spoke in a low voice, just quiet enough not to wake the girl, though she was still unconscious. "What are you doing?" Vincent didn't answer. He looked down at the floor of the car, where Nero lay still, his muzzle still resting on the girl's shoes. The dog's deep-set eyes finally closing, for the first time in many hours, as if only now did he feel safe enough to sleep. The Bentley drove north, through dark streets, past silent neighborhoods, heading toward Lincoln Park. No one said another word, and in that silence, amid the scent of leather, the scent of cashmere, and the damp, cold smell of the street still clinging to the girl's clothes, Vincent Drago began to realize that tonight he had brought home something more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. Not the girl, not the dog, but the feeling that he was still capable of caring about someone. But to understand why that girl was lying on frozen concrete tonight, we need to go back to the months when Lydia Brennan's life was torn apart piece by piece until there was nothing left for her to hold on to. 2 years earlier, in a rundown apartment in West Garfield Park, Lydia sat curled up on the kitchen floor. Blood seeped from the corner of her mouth, ran down her chin, and dripped onto the shirt that was already worn thin and torn. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her pregnant belly. Her body bent inward as if she herself were the last shield protecting the child inside her. Above her, Troy Felton stood there breathing hard, his fist still clenched, his eyes red from alcohol and something even darker than drunkenness. He kicked the table leg, sending bowls and plates clattering across the floor, then stormed out and slammed the door behind him. Lydia didn't cry. She'd run out of tears a long time ago. She only lay there, one hand still cradling her stomach, listening to the faint little movements of the baby inside her, the only thing that still gave her a reason not to let go. A few months later, at Cook County Hospital, Lydia held Rosalie for the first time. The baby was tiny, her face flushed red, crying at the top of her lungs, then falling silent the moment Lydia's skin touched hers. Lydia remembered that moment more clearly than anything else in her life. The smell of milk, the warmth of that tiny body, and the feeling, for the first time in 2 years, of understanding what it meant to be loved without pain attached to it. But that moment didn't last. Troy was arrested 3 weeks after Rosalie was born, not for what he'd done to Lydia, but because he got drunk, got into a fight outside a bar, and the police found an old warrant for domestic violence. The police came to the apartment to take a statement. They saw the bruises on Lydia's wrists, saw that the room had no hot water, saw the empty refrigerator. They called CPS. A child welfare worker came 2 days later. They asked Lydia whether she had a permanent address. She shook her head. The apartment belonged to Troy. Troy had been arrested, and she couldn't afford the rent. They asked whether she had any income. She shook her head. They asked whether she had any relatives who could help. She shook her head a third time, and with each shake of her head, she saw the look in their eyes change, from sympathy to concern, from concern to decision. The court ordered Rosalie placed in temporary foster care when she was 4 months old. That day, 2 CPS workers came to the room Lydia was staying in for the time being. One held the paperwork. The other carried a portable infant seat. Lydia held Rosalie so tightly that the baby cried from being squeezed. She begged them. She said she'd find work. She'd find somewhere to live. She just needed more time. But the papers had already been signed. The court order had already been issued. Gently but firmly, they pried Rosalie out of her arms. Lydia remembered that feeling, the weight of her baby leaving her chest, the warm emptiness suddenly turning ice cold. Then came the crying. Rosalie cried all the way down the hallway, the sound growing smaller and smaller until the building door on the ground floor shut, and Lydia couldn't hear anything anymore except silence. She sat on the floor of the empty room, staring at the hospital bracelet still on her wrist, and swore that she'd come back for her daughter. But the streets of Chicago don't make room for promises from people who have nothing in their hands. The months that followed were a downward spiral. Lydia couldn't stop. She lost the room she was renting, lost the only job she had washing dishes because she had no address where her pay could be sent, and then lost her health when winter came crashing in. She slept at bus stations, beneath store awnings, in shelters when there was space. Every week, she walked to St. Margaret's Children's Home, stood outside the fence, and looked toward the playground, hoping to see Rosalie even though she knew the baby was still too young to be out there. She stood there until her legs went numb with cold, then turned away. Then, 2 weeks before tonight, Lydia found Nero. The dog was lying behind a row of trash bins in the industrial district near the Chicago Canal, breathing in rough, rattling bursts, his front legs swollen and oozing pus. His eyes were almost completely shut. Anyone else would have walked away. Lydia didn't. She sat down beside the dog, opened her last bottle of water, poured half of it over the wound, and washed away the pus and dirt. She tore the sleeve off her coat and wrapped it around the dog's leg. Then she took the only half loaf of bread in her bag, broke it in 2, and placed 1/2 in front of Nero's muzzle. The dog lifted his head, looked at her with those deep-set eyes, then ate slowly. Lydia ate the other half. It was the last decent meal she had. From that day on, Lydia went hungry so Nero could eat. She searched for leftovers, asked for old bread from bakeries just before they closed, dug through trash bins behind restaurants, and whatever she found, she gave the dog his share first and herself second. Nero slowly recovered. The swelling in his leg went down. He began to walk again, and then he followed her everywhere like a giant loyal shadow. But Lydia went in the opposite direction. She grew thinner by the day. Her legs began to shake when she walked. Her head spun whenever she stood up too fast. And tonight, beneath the I-90 overpass, the cold and the hunger finally brought her down. She collapsed onto the concrete, and Nero, the dog she'd saved with half a loaf of bread and a torn coat sleeve, lay down beside her, pressed his body tight against hers, and didn't leave. Lydia opened her eyes and didn't recognize a single thing around her. The ceiling was high and painted white. The chandelier was dark, but the soft glow from a table lamp spread gently across the room. The sheets were soft. The air smelled of lavender, and warmth from the heating system moved steadily through the space. Her body was lying on a bed larger than any bed she had ever seen in her life, and her first instinct wasn't relief. It was fear. Lydia jerked upright, her heart pounding wildly, her eyes sweeping across the room like a trapped animal. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who had brought her here, didn't know how long she had been unconscious. Her feet touched the warm wooden floor, and she recoiled at once into the corner of the room, her back pressed to the wall, both hands raised in front of her chest. That wasn't the posture of someone who had just woken up. That was the posture of someone who'd been hit enough times to know that when you open your eyes in a strange place, the first thing you need to do is protect your face and your stomach. The door opened softly. An older woman stepped in, her silver hair pinned neatly up, a white apron tied around her waist, her face round, with kind eyes that time had marked with deep lines at the corners. She was carrying a tray with water and a warm towel. When she saw Lydia huddled in the corner, she stopped at once, didn't move any closer, set the tray down on the table near the door, then stepped back. "You're safe, dear. No one's going to hurt you here." Her voice was warm and slow, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd spent a lifetime calming things wilder than a frightened girl. "My name's Pearl. I've been looking after this house a long time." Lydia didn't answer. Her eyes were still moving across the room, searching for an exit, searching for danger, searching for anything that could explain why she was here. Then she asked, her voice rough from days of not drinking enough water. Only one question. "Where's my dog?" Pearl blinked, then gave a small nod. "He's right next door. Hasn't left the hallway since they brought you in." Lydia stood up immediately. Her legs trembled, her knees nearly gave way, but she caught herself against the wall and made her way to the door. Pearl didn't stop her, only moved aside. Lydia opened the door and saw Nero lying just outside the threshold, his massive head resting on his front paws, his eyes open, waiting. The moment he saw her, the dog rose at once, his tail giving a small wag, his nose brushing against her hand. Lydia dropped to her knees on the hallway floor, wrapped her arms around Nero's neck, buried her face in his dark fur, and cried. Not out loud, only with shaking shoulders and broken breaths. She cried like someone who had just found the only thing left in the world that still belonged to her. Nero stood still and let her hold him, let her cry, his short tail still wagging slowly. Then a voice came from the far end of the hallway. Low, deep, not cold, but not warm either. "She's awake." Lydia lifted her head. Vincent Drago was standing about 10 steps away, one shoulder resting against the frame of his study door. He had changed out of the blood-stained suit into a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but there was still that heavy kind of power about him that no change of clothes could hide. Lydia looked at him, and she recognized him. Not his face, but the name. Drago. Everyone on the south side knew that name. People whispered it in bars, on sidewalks, in shelters. Drago meant don't ask, don't look, don't get involved. The blood drained from Lydia's face. She stood up, one hand still resting on Nero's head. "I want to leave." Vincent didn't move. "You almost died last night." "I don't care. I'm leaving." She looked around for her shoes, for her coat, for anything that belonged to her. "With my dog." Vincent tilted his head slightly. Then he said, in the calm tone of someone commenting on the weather, "The dog is mine." Silence. Lydia went still, her hand tightening in Nero's fur. She looked at Vincent, then down at the dog, then back at Vincent, and something flared in her eyes. Not fear anymore, but something harder. Something 2 years of beatings and 8 months on the street hadn't managed to kill. "I found him dying behind a dumpster. I cleaned his wound with my last water. I fed him when I had nothing left for myself. He's mine now." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't weak. Every word came out clear and firm, like someone drawing the last line she was willing to die defending. Vincent looked at her. Then he took one step forward, only one, and Nero moved. The dog turned and placed himself between Lydia and Vincent, his head lowered, his eyes locked on his former owner, a deep growl beginning low in his chest. He wasn't being vicious. He was being clear. He chose to stand in the middle, and he chose to face the girl. Vincent stopped. He looked at the dog his wife had given him, the dog he had raised, the dog he had spent 3 weeks searching for, and that dog was protecting a homeless girl instead of returning to him. The hallway fell silent. Pearl stood behind them and said nothing. Then Vincent did something that Paxton would later say he had never done before. He stepped back. "Keep him." Lydia blinked, not believing it. Vincent continued, his voice still calm, but something inside it had shifted, so faintly that only someone listening very closely would have heard it. "But you stay here until you're strong enough to walk out that door on your own." It wasn't an offer. It wasn't an order. It was a single condition, laid down by a man who was used to laying down conditions for an entire city. Lydia stared at him for a long moment. She wanted to refuse. Everything in her wanted to refuse, because she had learned that when men give you something, they always come back asking for more. But her legs were still shaking. Her stomach was still twisting with hunger, and Nero was looking at her with those deep eyes, his tail giving a soft wag, as if he were telling her that this place was all right, that this place was safe, at least for now. Lydia swallowed. "I'm not staying because of you. I'm staying because of him." She looked down at Nero. Vincent almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned away, walked back into his study, and closed the door so gently Lydia almost didn't hear it. She stood there in the hallway, one hand on Nero's head, looking at the closed door and wondering what kind of world she had just stepped into. For the first 3 days inside the Lincoln Park mansion, Lydia Brennan lived as if she were hiding inside the very room they had given her. She didn't step outside the door unless she needed to use the bathroom, and even then, she looked left and right down the hallway before coming out, then slipped back inside as quickly as she could. Nero stayed in the room with her, stretched out on the wooden floor beside the bed, his massive head resting on his front paws, his eyes following her whenever she moved. Every morning, Pearl left a tray of food outside the bedroom door. On the first day, it was scrambled eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice, and a bowl of oatmeal. Lydia opened the door only after she heard Pearl's footsteps fade into the distance, looked at the tray, then did what she had done for the past 2 weeks on the streets. She broke the bread in half and set one piece in front of Nero's muzzle. She spooned part of the eggs onto a smaller plate for the dog. Then she ate what was left, slowly, in tiny bites, like someone who had grown used to never knowing whether another meal would come, and so had learned to stretch the one in front of her for as long as possible. Pearl collected the tray at noon and saw the food divided in half, the oatmeal bowl only half finished. She didn't say anything to Lydia. But that afternoon, she knocked on Vincent's study door. She feeds the dog first, then eats after him, and she barely eats at all. Vincent was sitting behind his desk, looking over papers, and he didn't lift his head, but his hand stopped on the page for 1 second. Only 1 second. Then he gave a slight nod. On the morning of the second day, when Lydia opened the door to take the tray, she found 2 trays there. One tray was for a person, arranged with a full breakfast. The other tray, set lower on the floor, held cooked chicken, rice, and a bowl of clean water, meant for the dog. There wasn't a note explaining it. There wasn't a message. There were only 2 trays, placed side by side outside her door, as if that arrangement were the most natural thing in the world. Lydia stood looking at the 2 trays for a long time. She didn't know how to respond to kindness that asked for nothing in return, because she'd forgotten what that felt like. She carried both trays into the room, fed Nero his portion, and then, for the first time in many days, she ate all of hers. Vincent didn't knock on her door. He didn't send anyone to check on her. He didn't appear without warning, but he was there. Every night, when the mansion sank into silence, Lydia heard slow footsteps in the hallway, then the creak of a chair, then quiet. On the second night, she was curious enough to creep to the door and look through the narrow opening. Vincent was sitting in an armchair in the hallway just outside, about 5 steps from her door, one leg crossed over the other, a file resting on his lap, a small reading lamp clipped to the back of the chair. He was working. Here, not in the elegant study downstairs, but here, in the chair outside the hallway, like a voluntary guard at the gate. Nero was lying at his feet, The dog's tail gave a faint wag whenever Vincent turned a page. Sometimes the dog lifted his head and sniffed at Vincent's hand, and Vincent would lower that hand to stroke Nero's head gently, without taking his eyes off the page. Lydia stood behind the cracked door and watched that hand. A broad hand, long fingers, knuckles roughened with calluses. A hand she was certain had done terrible things before, but at this moment, that hand was stroking the dog's head with a gentleness she hadn't thought could exist in a man like him. Nero let out a soft little sound, leaned his head into Vincent's palm, then got to his feet and wandered down the hall, nosing at Lydia's door. She stepped back quickly to let Nero in, then closed the door again. The dog jumped onto the foot of the bed, lay down, and closed his eyes at once. He had just been with Vincent, and now he had come back to her, back and forth, between two people who didn't speak to each other. Nero moved like an invisible thread joining two worlds that existed beneath the same roof but had not yet touched. On the third day, Pearl changed the flowers in Lydia's room. A small vase sat on the table beside the window. Lydia looked at the flowers but said nothing. She walked to the window and looked out over the snow-covered garden, the high iron fence, the stone path leading toward the gate. Everything was clean, orderly, expensive, and completely unfamiliar. She pressed her hand to the cold window pane and looked down at the hospital bracelet on her wrist. Rosalie. Her daughter was still out there somewhere. In a children's home she didn't even know how far away. And she was here, in a Mafia boss's mansion, eating free food, sleeping in a bed with white sheets, while her daughter was sleeping in a stranger's crib. She tightened her fingers around the plastic bracelet, closed her eyes, and whispered the same promise she had whispered every night for the past 8 months. "I'm coming back for you." Out in the hallway, the quiet sound of papers turning drifted through the silence. Vincent was still sitting there. On the fourth day, Lydia opened the door to her room and didn't step back. Vincent was sitting in the familiar chair outside in the hallway, a file resting on his lap, a cup of black coffee on the floor beside the chair leg. Nero stretched out at his feet. Every night before this, she had only looked through the crack in the door, then closed it again. But this morning, something had changed. Maybe 3 days of sleeping in a warm bed had given her back enough strength to feel anger instead of only fear. Maybe she was tired of not understanding why she was here. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked straight at him. Vincent looked up. He didn't seem surprised, as if he had been expecting this since the first day and had simply known he needed enough patience. "Why are you helping me?" Lydia's voice was no longer as raw as it had been the day she woke up, but it still carried that sharp wariness of someone who had learned that free kindness doesn't exist. Vincent closed the file slowly and set it on the small table beside the chair. "You saved my dog." Lydia narrowed her eyes. "That's not enough reason for someone like you." Vincent tilted his head slightly. "Someone like me? A killer." The word dropped into the silent hallway like a pebble falling into a deep well. No echo, no rebound. It only sank. Lydia didn't say it to insult him. She said it because it was the truth they both knew, and she had no intention of pretending she was in the home of an ordinary businessman. She was in Vincent Drago's house, and she wanted to know what price she would have to pay. Vincent looked at her. He didn't get angry. He didn't defend himself. He looked at her with the calm eyes of a man who had heard that word too many times for it to leave any wound anymore. Then he looked down at Nero. The dog lay quietly at his feet, eyes half closed, ears still angled toward both of them as if listening. Vincent spoke, his voice lower now. Not because he was trying to lower it, but because what he was about to say belonged to the part of his life he rarely opened to anyone. "Nero was a gift from my wife." Lydia went still. She hadn't expected the answer to turn in that direction. She had been bracing herself for a threat, for conditions, for demands. Not for this. "Where is she?" she asked before she had time to think, and the moment the question left her mouth, she realized she already knew the answer from the way he had said the word wife in the past tense. "Dead," Vincent said. Then he paused for a beat, not hesitation. The kind of silence that comes from someone deciding how much is enough to say, "Car bomb, 5 years ago." He stopped. Nero shifted at his feet, his tail brushing lightly against Vincent's trouser leg in an unconscious reflex. "My son, too." He was 3. The hallway was so quiet Lydia could hear snowmelt dripping somewhere outside the window at the far end. She looked at Vincent, and for the first time since waking up in this house, she didn't see a Mafia boss sitting in a chair in the hallway. She saw a father who had lost his child. She knew exactly what that felt like. Not exactly the same, because her daughter was still alive somewhere in this city, but the pain was the same. That hollow space in the chest, that stab every time you saw a child out on the street, that feeling of reaching out in the dark and touching the empty place where your own child used to be. Vincent had lived with that emptiness for 5 years, and he had let it turn him into stone. Lydia understood that, because she had almost turned into stone herself on the frozen concrete beneath the overpass the night before. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She had heard those words too many times in her life and knew how meaningless they could be. Instead, she said the thing only someone carrying the same kind of pain could understand. "That's why you went looking for the dog." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, because she understood that Nero wasn't just a dog. Nero was the last piece left of the wife who had died, of the son who was gone, of the life Vincent had been robbed of. Looking for Nero meant trying to recover the only thing still left from his old family. Vincent didn't answer, but the way he looked at her changed. Slightly, almost too faint to notice, but it changed. Before this, he had looked at her the way a man looks at a problem that needs solving. Now he looked at her like someone he had just realized was speaking the same language. Nero got to his feet, stretched, wandered over to Lydia, sniffed her hand, then turned and lay back down beside Vincent's feet. Back and forth. Always back and forth. Lydia leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. For the first time, she wasn't standing in a defensive posture. "I didn't know about your family," she said softly. Then she added, her voice even lower, "I've got a daughter too." Vincent looked up. Not with impatience, not with obvious curiosity, only with quiet waiting, the same way he had waited for 3 days outside this hallway. But Lydia didn't say anything more. Not yet. She had opened the door a crack, but she still wasn't ready to step through it. She turned and went back into the room, closing the door gently behind her. But this time, she didn't lock it. The unlocked door that night changed something between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing clear enough to name, but enough that on the 5th day, when Vincent sat in the chair outside the hallway as he did every evening, Lydia opened the door, stepped out, and sat down on the floor across from him, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She didn't look at him. She looked at Nero lying between them, and she began to speak. Not in order, not from the beginning, in fragments, like someone gathering broken glass with bare hands and offering each shard one at a time. She told him about the last room she had before she ended up on the street, that it was so small Rosalie's crib had to sit right beside the stove, that every time she cooked, she was afraid the heat would drift toward her baby's face. Then she told him about the last night, the night before CPS came. She knew they were coming because the public defender had called ahead, his voice gentle but firm, saying the court had already issued the order, saying she should prepare herself, saying this was only temporary. Temporary. She hated that word. That night, Lydia didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of that rented room with Rosalie in her arms, her back against the wall, and she sang. She only knew one song, the song she used to hear on the radio in the laundromat where she had worked before she met Troy. She didn't remember the name of it, didn't remember the singer, only the melody and a few lines of the lyrics. She sang that song over and over all night long, her voice soft, just enough for Rosalie to hear. The baby lay quietly in her arms, her wide eyes looking up, her tiny hand wrapped around Lydia's finger. She sang until morning came, until the knock at the door. Lydia stopped there. She didn't tell the rest of it, the part where CPS took Rosalie away, because she had relived that scene enough times in nightmares every night and didn't need to live it one more time while she was awake. Vincent sat still. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't react. He simply sat there, the file long since closed, the coffee in his cup gone cold on the floor. Then Lydia gave him the next piece. She told him that every week, she walked to St. Margaret's Children's Home, 4 miles from wherever she was sleeping at the time, through streets where she had to keep her head down and avoid meeting anyone's eyes, past intersections where drunk men called after her, through neighborhoods that weren't entirely safe even in daylight for a woman walking alone. She walked there, stood outside the fence, and looked into the playground. Rosalie was too young to be out there, she knew that, but she still came, every week. She stood there for about an hour, her hands gripping the iron bars, staring up at the second-floor windows where she guessed the nursery might be, and she wondered what her daughter was doing, whether anyone was holding her, whether anyone was singing to her. Then she would turn away, walk 4 miles back to wherever she'd been staying, and wait for the next week. Nero lifted his head when Lydia's voice began to shake. The dog crawled closer to her and rested his muzzle on her knee. Lydia placed her hand on his head and asked a question she had clearly been carrying inside herself for a very long time. A question she had never dared ask anyone because she was afraid of the answer. "Do you think she still remembers my voice?" The hallway fell silent. Vincent didn't answer right away. He looked at Lydia's hand on Nero's head, looked at the hospital bracelet still wrapped around her wrist, and something rose in his chest that he had spent 5 years trying to bury. He remembered Leo. He remembered that Sunday morning, before the explosion, when the boy had been sitting on the kitchen floor playing with a little wooden toy car. He had looked up at Vincent, smiled so wide that his whole tiny face became a smile, then ran over with both arms raised, and Vincent had picked him up. Small fingers curled around one of his, holding tight, the way children hold on when they believe that as long as they can grasp their father, everything will be all right. 4 hours later, Leo was dead. Vincent swallowed the memory down. He had done that thousands of times, swallowed it, forced it deep into the darkest place in his chest, locked it away, and never looked back. But tonight, with the girl sitting on the floor in his hallway, her hand on the dog, asking whether her daughter still remembered her mother's voice, that lock trembled for the first time. "She does," Vincent said. 2 words. His voice was lower than usual, only slightly, but enough to make Lydia lift her head and look at him. She saw something in his eyes she had never imagined could exist there. Not tears. Vincent Drago wasn't the kind of man who cried. It was recognition, the same pain. He had lost his son forever. She had lost her daughter for now, but the hollow in the chest was the same shape, the same size, the same kind of silence at 3 a.m. when the whole world was asleep, and all that remained was you and the memory of the child no longer resting in your arms. They didn't say much after that. Lydia sat there a little while longer, her hand still on Nero's head, then got to her feet and went back into her room. But before she closed the door, she stopped, turned to look at Vincent still sitting quietly in the chair, and said softly, "I'm sorry about your boy." Then she closed the door. She didn't lock it. Vincent sat there for a long time after the lights in the hallway had gone out. Nero lay at his feet, breathing steadily, and in the darkness, the man all of Chicago called a devil sat alone, remembering the smile of his 3-year-old son. And for the first time in 5 years, he didn't try to bury it. On the 7th day, Vincent wasn't sitting outside the hallway. That morning, when Lydia opened the door to take her tray of food, the chair was empty. The file was no longer on the small table. The cup of coffee was gone. Only Nero was lying outside the door as always, lifting his head to look at her before giving a small wag of his tail. Lydia stood in the doorway longer than usual, looking at the empty chair, and realized that she had grown more used to that silent presence than she had understood. She didn't know that early that morning, Vincent had called Henley Voss into his study and handed him a sheet of paper with only 2 words written on it. Rosalie Brennan. Henley looked at the paper, then at Vincent. He didn't ask why. He had worked for Vincent long enough to know that when the boss handed over a name, the only thing that mattered was finding out everything there was to know about it. It took Henley less than half a day. The Drago family's network reached into every corner of Chicago, from the police department to the courts, from hospitals to welfare agencies. By mid-afternoon, a file was resting on Vincent's desk. The report identified the child as Rosalie Brennan, 12 months old, currently at St. Margaret's Children's Home, and listed her mother as Lydia Brennan, healthy, developing normally, not yet formally adopted, still in temporary foster care. The custody case was assigned to Judge Whitmore, a man known throughout the Cook County family court system as strict but fair. The file clearly listed the conditions the mother had to meet in order to regain custody of her child: a permanent address, stable and legal income, proof of a safe living environment for the child, and finally, the court had to confirm that Troy Felton was no longer a threat to mother and daughter. Vincent read the file twice, then he closed it, placed both hands on the desk, and sat still for a long time. He thought about what Lydia had told him the night before, about the girl who walked 4 miles every week just to stand outside the fence and look in, about the question of whether her daughter still remembered her mother's voice, about the hospital bracelet she had kept on for 8 months without taking it off. He had lost Leo. He knew what it felt like to reach into an empty crib in the middle of the night. He knew what it felt like to look at a high chair at the table with no one sitting in it. He hadn't been able to save his son, but this child was still alive, and this mother was still fighting. Vincent picked up the file, got to his feet, and went upstairs. He knocked on Lydia's door. 2 short knocks, then silence. The first time he had knocked instead of sitting outside the hallway and waiting, Lydia opened the door. She looked at him, then at the file in his hand, and her whole body went tense at once, because in her experience paperwork had never brought good news. Vincent didn't step into the room. He stood at the threshold and held the file out toward her. "Your daughter's at St. Margaret's. She's healthy. 12 months old. No one's adopted her." Lydia didn't take the file. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door so hard her knuckles turned white. She knew where her daughter was. She had stood outside that fence dozens of times. But hearing someone else say the name of that children's home, confirming that her daughter was still there, still healthy, still waiting, made something inside her chest break apart and heal at the same time. Vincent continued, "Your case is assigned to Judge Whitmore. To get Rosalie back, you need 4 things. A permanent address, a job with income, proof the home is safe for a child, and the court has to confirm that Troy Felton is no longer a threat." He stopped, giving her time to absorb each condition. Then he spoke again, his tone steady but every word carrying weight. "I can help you get her back." Silence. Lydia looked at him. Her eyes were red, but there were no tears there. She had run out of tears long ago where Rosalie was concerned. She looked at the file, then back at Vincent, and he saw in her eyes the same battle he had seen from the first night beneath the overpass. She wanted to believe him, but she was afraid of the price. She was afraid that if she accepted help from this man, she would owe him something she couldn't possibly repay. She was afraid that one day he would use Rosalie as leverage, the way Troy had once used the baby as a chain to bind her in place. And more than anything, she was afraid that if she let herself hope and then failed, this time she wouldn't be able to get back up. Her voice shook when she asked, low, almost a whisper, "If I let you help, you won't take her from me?" That question wasn't only for Vincent. It was for every man who had ever made promises and then taken something from her. It was for Troy, for the CPS workers, for the whole world that had reached into her life and torn her child from her arms. Vincent looked straight into Lydia's eyes. He saw there the same thing he had seen on that first night when she had fought to keep Nero, the desperate stubbornness of someone prepared to lose everything except one thing. That night, it had been the dog. Now it was her child. And he understood that what he said in this moment carried more weight than any promise he had ever made in his life, because it wouldn't only decide whether she trusted him, it would decide whether she dared to hope again. "I'm not here to take anything from you." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't swear an oath. Just 6 words, spoken evenly, his eyes never leaving hers. Lydia looked at him for a few more seconds. Then, slowly, she let go of the doorframe. Her shoulders lowered. Not much, only an inch or 2, but enough for Vincent to notice. She reached out and took the file from his hand, and when her fingers touched the cover, she gripped it the way a drowning person grabs the last piece of wood floating past. She didn't say thank you. Not yet. But she held the file against her chest, stepped back into the room, and this time, when she closed the door, she did it so gently there was almost no sound at all. Vincent stood there a moment longer, looking at the closed door, then turned and walked back down the stairs. Nero stood in the middle of the hallway, watching him go, then turned toward Lydia's door, then looked back after him again. In the end, the dog chose to lie down right in the middle of the hallway, halfway between the two of them, as if he understood that his work wasn't finished yet. That night, after Lydia closed her bedroom door with the file clutched against her chest, Vincent didn't go upstairs. He went straight into his study on the ground floor, shut the door, and didn't turn on the main light. Only the glow from the small desk lamp lit half the room. He sat down in the leather chair behind the desk, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and didn't drink it. The glass remained there on the desktop, amber beneath the yellow light, while his eyes drifted elsewhere. The photograph. It stood on the shelf beside the window, placed there 5 years ago and never moved since. Marin was holding Leo near the window in their old house, the morning sunlight spilling through her hair. Leo balanced on her hip, one hand gripping the collar of Marin's shirt, the other reaching toward the camera, smiling. Vincent had taken that picture on an ordinary morning, one he couldn't remember by date or month. He only remembered that at the time, he had thought he would have a million more mornings just like it. He'd been wrong. He looked at the photograph, and the memory he had forced back down the night before when Lydia asked about a mother's voice rose again, stronger now, refusing to sink. Sunday morning, March, 5 years earlier. He was standing at the front door with his car keys in his hand. Marin was wearing a white coat, crouched on the front step, tying Leo's shoelaces. The boy kept kicking his legs, refusing to stay still, his mouth going nonstop in that half-word, half-sound language of a 3-year-old. Marin laughed and said something Vincent couldn't clearly remember anymore, then let go of the boy. Leo took off at once, his little legs moving fast, running straight toward the car parked outside the house. Vincent called out, "Leo, come back." The boy didn't listen. He ran toward the car, reached up for the door handle, and looked back over his shoulder at his father with a grin. Then came the explosion. Not the kind you hear in movies, loud and dramatic. It was the kind of sound no one is ever ready for. Heavy, blunt, swallowing everything around it whole. The ground shook, glass shattered, white smoke burst up and blocked out everything. And after that came silence, the kind of silence Vincent Drago would carry with him for the rest of his life. He ran toward the car. He remembered running. He remembered the smell of hot metal and burning plastic. He remembered shouting Leo's name, shouting Marin's name. He remembered Henley dragging him back, holding him back, and he remembered hitting Henley to make him let go. But he didn't remember when he stopped shouting. He only knew that by the time the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to shout for. Grant Caruso. That name came later. Through investigations, the police never managed to finish, though the streets had known much earlier. The bomb had been planted beneath the car the night before. It had been meant for Vincent, but Leo had run out first. Marin had run after her son. Vincent had been standing 10 steps away and couldn't do a thing. 10 steps. That distance haunted him every night. After the funeral, Vincent Drago didn't cry. He didn't lose control in rage. He didn't drink himself into oblivion. He did something worse than all of that. He turned himself off, one feeling at a time. He shut it down, locked it away, buried it deep. He believed that if he felt nothing, then nothing could ever hurt him again. He turned himself into the thing all of Chicago feared. Cold, precise, merciless. He handled business with ruthless efficiency. He kept no one close. He let no one in. Paxton tried to reach him. Vincent pushed him away. Pearl tried to speak to him. Vincent gave her silence. Only Nero remained. The dog was the only living creature Vincent allowed himself to love, because Nero didn't ask questions, didn't judge, didn't need explanations. He only lay at Vincent's feet, rested his muzzle on Vincent's shoe, and stayed there. And when Nero disappeared 3 weeks earlier, Vincent searched for the dog with a desperation he hadn't given to any human being. Because losing Nero would have meant losing the last piece of Marin, the last piece of Leo, the last piece of proof that he had once had a family. And now Nero had come back. But he hadn't come back alone. He had brought that girl with him. The girl with the hospital bracelet, with the hardened eyes and the trembling voice, with the question of whether her daughter still remembered her mother's voice. Vincent looked at the photograph of Marin and Leo. Then he looked at the glass of whiskey still untouched. He didn't know that upstairs, Lydia Brennan was reading through the file, turning each page with trembling hands, seeing her daughter's name printed on official papers for the first time in 8 months. He didn't know whether she was crying soundlessly on that bed far too large for one person, with Nero lying beside her, his muzzle resting on her leg. He only knew that he had promised himself he would never let anyone get close again, and he was breaking that promise. He didn't know whether this was a second chance life had thrown at him, or a trap meant to crush him one final time. But he knew one thing. Marin's dog had chosen that girl, and maybe that was the only answer he needed. Rumors on the streets of Chicago moved faster than any car ever could. And in the underworld of the South Side, when a homeless girl vanished from beneath an overpass on the same night Vincent Drago's black Bentley was seen parked under the I-90 overpass, the story spread in only a few days. From bars to pawn shops, from street corners to shelters, people whispered that Drago had brought a girl home. And Troy Felton, even as a violent drunk who had just gotten out on parole, still had enough ties out on the street to hear that story. On the 9th day since Lydia arrived at the Lincoln Park mansion, Troy showed up. It was evening, around 9 o'clock. Vincent was downstairs in his study with Paxton, talking business. Lydia was upstairs, sitting on the bed reading through Rosalie's file for what had to be the 100th time. Nero lying at the foot of the bed. Pearl was cleaning the kitchen. Then the pounding came at the door. Not knocking, pounding, a fist slamming against the oak door again and again, violent, relentless, followed by the hoarse yell of a drunk man. "Open the damn door!" Henley got to the entrance within seconds. He opened the door just enough to block the frame with his body and looked outside. Troy Felton stood on the front steps, his coat wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his breath thick with cheap whiskey. He was thinner than he had been 2 years earlier, his cheeks hollow, his jaw unshaven for days, but his fists were still clenched with the reflex of a man used to settling everything with his hands. He looked Henley up and down, then tried to peer over his shoulder into the house. "I know she's in there." Henley didn't move. His face was still as frozen water. "You need to leave." Troy shoved forward 1 step. "That's my woman in there, and that baby's mine. I signed the birth certificate. You hear me? That gives me rights," he shouted, spittle flying, his finger stabbing straight toward Henley's face. His voice rang through the front garden, struck the brick walls, echoed past the windows, and carried into the house. And Lydia heard it. Upstairs, Troy's voice cut through the walls like a blade through paper. Lydia had been sitting on the bed when the file slipped from her hands and hit the floor, papers scattering everywhere. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her heart slammed wildly. Her breath came fast, short, shallow, as if someone were choking her though no one had touched her. Her hands shook, not with a light tremor, but so badly she couldn't even clench them into fists. She slid off the bed, pressed her back into the corner between the wardrobe and the window, drew her knees to her chest, and wrapped both arms over her head. The old position, the position her body had memorized from hundreds of nights in that apartment with Troy, when his footsteps came heavy across the floor and she knew what was coming. She wasn't in the Lincoln Park mansion anymore. She was back in that ruined apartment in West Garfield Park, and Troy was walking toward her, and there was nowhere to run. Nero reacted at once. The dog jumped off the bed, planted himself in front of Lydia, turned toward the bedroom door, ears up, the fur along his spine rising as a growl started deep in his chest, like an engine turning over. He stood between her and the door, 130 pounds of muscle and bone, ready for anything that crossed that threshold. Downstairs, Vincent had heard it too. He stepped out of the study, Paxton following behind him. He crossed the living room, moved through the hallway, and came to the front door. Henley was still standing there blocking the entrance, one hand braced on the frame, the other hanging at his side, but his thumb had already nudged back the edge of his suit jacket, exposing the gun holstered underneath. Troy was still yelling, "I got legal rights. You can't keep her from me. I'll call the cops. He cut off in the middle of the sentence, because Vincent Drago stepped into view behind Henley. Henley shifted aside. Vincent stood in the doorway, the light from inside falling behind him, his face hidden in shadow, leaving only the outline of broad shoulders and those cold eyes fixed directly on Troy. Troy knew who he was. Everyone on the south side did. He swallowed, his fists loosening just a little, but the liquor and the aggression kept him standing there instead of turning around and running. "I just want what's mine," Troy said, his voice lower now but still hard. "She's my girl. That baby's mine. I got the papers to prove it." Vincent looked at him. He looked at the calloused fists, looked at the bloodshot eyes, looked at the cheap violence leaking out of the man's stance, and he thought of the finger-shaped bruises on Lydia's wrist that he had seen on the first night in the car. He thought of the girl now curled into a corner upstairs, shaking because of the voice of the man standing in front of him, and something colder than a Chicago January night flashed in Vincent's eyes. He stepped down one stair. Just one. But Troy automatically backed up too. Vincent spoke, his voice low, slow, every word as clear as if carved into stone. "You touch her again, they won't find enough of you to bury." He didn't shout. He didn't make a loud show of threatening. Just 10 words spoken in the voice of a man who never had to say anything twice. Troy looked into Vincent's eyes and saw something there that even alcohol wasn't strong enough to make him ignore. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. The certainty that this man meant exactly what he had just said. Troy took another step back, then another. He raised his hands, pretending to be calm, pretending not to be afraid. "This ain't over," he muttered. Then he turned, staggered down the stone path, passed through the iron gate, and disappeared into the dark. Vincent stayed on the front steps a moment longer, watching until Troy's shape dissolved into the night. Then he turned to Henley. His voice returned to normal, cold, precise, stripped of excess feeling. Follow him. 24/7. I want to know where he sleeps, where he drinks, who he talks to, and pull everything you can on his record. Every arrest, every charge, every restraining order violation. All of it. Henley nodded once, then disappeared into the night without a sound. Vincent stood there for a few more seconds, breathing in the cold air, then went back inside, shut the door, and headed upstairs. He stopped outside Lydia's room. Inside, he could hear Nero making soft sounds, and the heavy, broken breathing of someone trying to control a panic attack. He didn't knock. He didn't go in. He sat down in the chair outside the hallway, in the same old place, and stayed there. Inside the room, Lydia was still in the corner. Nero pressed tightly beside her, his muzzle resting on her thigh. She heard the chair creak outside in the hallway and knew he was there. She didn't open the door, but her breathing slowed, little by little, because there was something about knowing that now, between her and Troy's voice, there was a door, a dog, and a man this entire city feared. Lydia couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and every time she closed them, Troy's voice came back as if he were still standing right outside the window. That's my woman. That baby's mine. She knew he wasn't here anymore. She knew the iron gate had been shut, the front door was locked, and Henley was somewhere out there in the night keeping watch on him. But her body didn't listen to reason. Her body was still back in that old apartment, still waiting for the heavy footsteps on the stairs, still curling in on itself, bracing for the next blow. Nero lay beside the bed, breathing steadily, letting out a soft sound now and then in his sleep. Lydia lowered her hand over the edge of the bed and touched the dog's head, feeling the warmth of thick fur beneath her fingers. It helped calm her, but not enough to let her sleep. 1 hour passed, then 2. Lydia gave up. She sat up, pulled on the sweater Pearl had left for her on the chair, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, but warm light from downstairs washed softly up along the staircase wall. She went down barefoot on the wooden steps, making no sound. Nero followed behind her in silence like a shadow. The living room downstairs was lit by the fireplace. The fire burned low, more glowing embers than flame, casting a trembling orange light across the walls and ceiling. Vincent was sitting in the leather armchair beside the fireplace, not in a comfortable posture, but in the posture of a man standing watch. His back was straight, his shoulders tilted slightly forward, his eyes open. On the small table by the arm of the chair, the gun lay there, black metal catching the firelight. He wasn't reading a file, he wasn't drinking, he was just sitting there, looking into the fire, keeping watch. Lydia stopped at the foot of the stairs. She looked at him, and in that moment, she didn't see the Mafia boss. She saw the man who had sat outside her hallway every night for nearly 10 days, not because of duty, not because he owed her anything, but because he had decided she would be safe in his house, and he would make certain of it with his own presence. Vincent heard her before he saw her. His eyes shifted from the fire to the foot of the staircase, and found her standing there in the oversized sweater, her hair loose, her feet bare. Nero pressed close beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask why she had come downstairs. He knew. Lydia crossed the living room, her steps hesitating slightly in the middle of the room, then sat down in the chair opposite Vincent, about 4 paces away from him, with the fireplace between them. She drew her legs up onto the chair, wrapped her arms around her knees, and looked into the fire. Nero lay down on the floor between the 2 chairs, resting his muzzle on his front paws, eyes half closed. And for the first time that night, the dog looked truly at peace, as if this place, right here between the 2 of them, was exactly where he belonged. They sat in silence. The fire crackled softly. The night wind gave a faint whistle outside the windows. No one spoke, and the strange thing was that the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It wasn't the tense silence of the first days, when she shut the door, and he sat outside waiting. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said enough that they didn't need to fill the space with words anymore. A few minutes passed, or maybe longer. Lydia couldn't tell. Then she turned to Vincent, and the question slipped out before she had time to weigh it. "Do you ever sleep?" Vincent didn't look at her right away. He watched the fire for 1 more beat, then turned toward her. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the hard edges, and for a moment he looked more tired than Lydia had ever seen him. Not physically tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from carrying too much for too long without ever allowing yourself to set it down. Not when someone's counting on me, he said. 4 words, his voice low, without any trace of grandeur or heroism, just the truth. The same way he had said Marin was dead, the same way he had said Leo was 3 years old. Truths he didn't dress up, didn't soften, only placed between them and left there. Lydia looked at him for a long moment. She looked into the eyes the whole city feared, and she saw something there that maybe no one else saw, or maybe no one else had ever been allowed close enough to see. Loneliness. Not loud loneliness, not the kind that complains about itself. The quiet loneliness of someone who had cut himself off from the world because he believed it was the only way to survive, and now no longer knew the way back. She knew that kind of loneliness. She had lived with it for 8 months on the streets. Lydia didn't say anything else. She sat there a little longer, watching the fire, then got to her feet. But instead of going straight back up the stairs, she walked to the sofa nearby and picked up the folded wool blanket from the armrest. The blanket Pearl always kept ready in the living room for cold nights. She walked over to Vincent's chair and draped the blanket over his shoulders. Gently, without a word, the way she had once tucked a blanket over Rosalie on that last night before CPS came. The way she had once split a loaf of bread with Nero out on the street. The instinct to care for someone, the one thing life had never managed to take from her. Her hand brushed lightly against his shoulder as she pulled the blanket across him, only for a second, then drew back. Vincent didn't move. He didn't turn his head. He didn't say thank you. But on the arm of the chair, where the firelight didn't reach, his hand tightened. His fingers closed slowly into his palm, like a man trying to hold on to something that had just touched him and was afraid it might slip away. Lydia walked back up the stairs, Nero following behind her. She didn't look back, and Vincent sat there, with the blanket over his shoulders, the fire burning lower and lower, looking at the empty place where she had just been sitting. For the first time in 5 years, the warmth he felt didn't come from the fire in the hearth. Grant Caruso wasn't the kind of man who missed an opportunity. He had built his empire on the south side of Chicago, by reading his enemies' weaknesses faster than anyone else. And for 5 years, Vincent Drago had given him no weakness to read. No family, no loved ones, nothing except a dog and a gun. But when Caruso's eyes and ears reported that Drago had brought a girl back to the Lincoln Park mansion, that he had hired a lawyer for her, that a child was involved, Caruso knew immediately that for the first time in 5 years, Vincent Drago had left his side exposed, and Caruso was the man who had planted the bomb beneath the car that killed Marin and Leo. He didn't hesitate to strike the softest place. That night, Vincent came home late, close to midnight. The meeting with the shipping partners down by the South Harbor had run longer than expected, and when the Bentley pulled up at the mansion gate, Vincent stepped out with Paxton, his mind still turning over numbers and routes. The iron gate opened as usual. The front yard was quiet. A thin layer of snow covered the path, but when Vincent stepped onto the front porch, he stopped. The front door was locked. Normal. The hallway lights were on. Normal. But something was wrong. Something he couldn't see but could feel. By the instinct of a man who had lived in this world long enough to know when the air itself had changed. He signaled for Paxton to stop, then circled around to the back of the house. The back door was slightly open. Just a narrow crack, enough for the wind to slip through, but enough for Vincent to know someone had entered the house. The lock wasn't broken. Someone had opened it, from inside or with a key. Vincent drew his gun, pulled back the slide, and stepped into the kitchen. Darkness. The smell of cold coffee Pearl had brewed earlier that afternoon. No sound downstairs. Then, from above, Nero barked. Not the bark of a dog spotting a stranger at the door. This was frantic, vicious, urgent barking, the kind Vincent had never heard from Nero in 5 years of keeping him. The bark of a dog protecting something with his life. Vincent ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his gun raised level with his face. Paxton came right behind him, his weapon already drawn as well. When Vincent reached the top of the second-floor hallway, he saw them. 2 men, one wearing a black leather jacket, a knife in his hand, the blade about 8 inches long, flashing beneath the hallway light. The second stood behind him, a handgun in his grip, its barrel aimed toward the far end of the hallway, toward Lydia's door. And in front of that door, Nero stood blocking the way. The dog stood braced on all 4 legs, his head lowered, the fur along the back of his neck raised into a ridge, his eyes locked on the 2 intruders, and from his chest came a steady, deep, rumbling growl like the sound of an engine turning over. 130 pounds of muscle and fang stood between the two killers and Lydia's door. He didn't back down. The man holding the knife had moved closer, only about 3 steps from Nero, the blade raised at chest level, trying to threaten the dog. But Nero wasn't some stray off the street. He was a Neapolitan Mastiff, a breed developed from the time of ancient Rome to guard and fight. He wasn't afraid of steel. He was afraid of losing what he was protecting. Inside the room, Lydia heard everything. Nero's growling, strange footsteps outside the door, whispered words in a man's voice she didn't recognize. But this time, she didn't curl into the corner. This time, she stood up. She looked around the room in the dark, and her hand reached for the fruit knife on the bedside table. The knife Pearl had given her the day before when she brought fruit upstairs. The blade was short, only about 4 inches, but Lydia held it tightly in her hand, her back against the wall beside the window, her face turned toward the bedroom door. Her eyes were wide, but not panicked. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already been afraid enough in her life. And tonight, in this house, with Rosalie's file lying on the table, she had something to lose. And people who have something to lose don't curl up. They pick up a knife. Out in the hallway, Vincent acted. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't order anyone to drop a weapon. This wasn't a movie. This was his house. And there were 2 armed men moving toward the door behind which the girl he had promised to protect was standing. He shot the man with the gun first. The bullet tore through the man's right shoulder, and he screamed, the handgun flying from his hand and skidding across the hardwood floor. The man with the knife spun around, panic flashing in his eyes, and in that split second of distraction, Nero lunged. 130 pounds, launched forward like a spring. The dog's jaws clamped down on the knife arm and dragged the man to the floor. The knife flew from his hand. The man screamed, trying to punch Nero in the head, but the dog didn't let go. He shook his head, tightened his jaws, and the man screamed louder. Paxton came in from behind, pinned down the man with the gunshot wound to the shoulder, forced him flat to the floor, and twisted his arm behind his back. Vincent stepped forward, kicked the knife out of reach, then said one word, "Nero, release." The dog opened his jaws and backed away, still growling, blood on his muzzle. The knife man lay on the floor, clutching his forearm, moaning. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. Vincent stood in front of Lydia's door. Blood was on his hand, not his, still smeared there from the moment he had dragged the wounded man out of the way. His chest was rising and falling. Adrenaline was burning through his veins. He knocked lightly with the back of his hand, because his fingers were still wrapped around the gun. Lydia. Inside, silence for 1 beat, then the sound of the lock opening. The door cracked open. Lydia stood there, the fruit knife still in her hand, the blade pointed down, her eyes looking straight at him. She looked at the blood on his hand, looked at the gun, heard the moaning behind him in the hallway. Then she looked into his eyes. "Are you hurt?" Vincent asked, his voice still rough because his breathing hadn't fully steadied yet. Lydia shook her head slowly. Then she spoke, her voice soft, but every word as solid as the stone beneath the house. "You kept your promise." Vincent looked at her, looked at the knife in her hand, looked at the eyes that weren't panicked, looked at the way her back was straight instead of folded in on itself, and he realized that the girl standing before him tonight was no longer the girl who had lain unconscious on frozen concrete 10 days earlier. Something had changed in her. And when she said those 3 words, something changed in him too. The morning after the break-in, Vincent sat in his study with Caruso's 2 henchmen tied to chairs in the basement below, and a decision to make before sunrise. The old way would have been simple. 2 bullets, 2 tarps, a drive out to the Chicago Canal at 4 in the morning. The old way would have sent a message to Caruso in blood, the way Vincent had done many times over the last 5 years. But Vincent looked up at the ceiling, where upstairs, Lydia was sleeping with Nero stretched across the doorway, and he thought about the file on her table, about the court hearing ahead, about Judge Whitmore, about Rosalie at St. Margaret's Children's Home. If he handled this the old way, Caruso would retaliate. A gang war would erupt. This mansion would become a target, and Lydia, the girl trying to get her child back in court, would be dragged into a war she had never chosen. Vincent called Henley at 5 in the morning, not to dispose of bodies, but to find a phone number. Agent Dwyer, FBI. Over the next week, the rhythm of the house changed, not in any dramatic way, but in small, precise movements, like chess pieces being shifted across a board only Vincent could see in full. He hired Margaret Chen, one of the best family lawyers in Cook County, for Lydia. Chen wasn't cheap. Her fee ran into 4 figures an hour. But she had something money couldn't buy: credibility in front of Judge Whitmore. When Chen met Lydia for the first time at the mansion, she looked at the thin girl sitting on the sofa clutching the file that had gone soft and wrinkled from being read too many times, and she spoke plainly. "I won't sugarcoat this. You need a fixed address, a steady income, and proof that Troy Felton is no longer a threat. You have 2 of those. We need to build the 3rd. Lydia nodded. She had read the file often enough to know every condition by heart. At the same time, Pearl began teaching Lydia how to cook, not because Lydia needed to know how to cook in order to get her daughter back, but because Vincent was arranging a job for her at Rosso, the Italian restaurant in the West Loop that the Drago family owned completely legally, under a clean business name, fully taxed, with transparent books. Lydia would start as a kitchen assistant, paid hourly, with a formal employment contract. Every single thing the court needed to see in black and white on paper. Every afternoon, Pearl stood beside Lydia in the mansion kitchen, teaching her how to chop vegetables, how to simmer broth, how to knead pasta dough. Lydia learned quickly. Her hands were fast and precise, and Pearl told Vincent that the girl had better kitchen instincts than most professionally trained cooks. But Vincent only nodded when he heard that, because his mind was elsewhere. Elsewhere was a secret meeting at a coffee shop in Ukrainian village, 20 minutes by car from the mansion. Agent Dwyer sat across from Vincent, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, an unreadable face, and sharp eyes, the kind of eyes belonging to a man who had watched Chicago's underworld for so long that no one impressed him anymore. Vincent placed a USB drive on the table. 5 years of evidence. Transactions, shipping routes, laundering accounts, lists of enforcers. All of it on Caruso. Vincent didn't explain why he had these things. He only said what he wanted. "You take Caruso down. Completely. Federal charges, RICO, everything. And my name stays out of it." Dwyer looked at the USB, then at Vincent. "The Bureau's been building a case on Caruso for 3 years. This would finish it." Vincent gave a slight nod. "Then we have a deal." Dwyer looked at him a moment longer, and Vincent knew the man was wondering why. Why now? Why? After 5 years of silence, Vincent Drago suddenly wanted Caruso removed through the law, instead of through a bullet. But Dwyer didn't ask. The FBI doesn't refuse gifts. That afternoon, Vincent returned to the mansion and found Paxton waiting for him in the study. His younger brother stood beside the desk, arms folded across his chest, his face tense. Henley had told Paxton. "Of course he had. You're handing our enemy to the feds?" Paxton asked, his voice controlled but unable to hide his disapproval. "Caruso killed Marin and Leo. And you're letting the government handle it?" "That's not how we do things." Vincent sat down in his chair and looked at his brother. He understood Paxton's anger. In their world, the man who killed your family paid in blood, not in federal court. But Vincent had seen where that road ended. He had paid in blood for 5 years, and the only result had been an empty house, sleepless nights, and a heart turned to stone. "I'm making sure he never touches anyone I care about again," he said, calmly, clearly, as if he were discussing business strategy, rather than a decision that would shift the balance of power in Chicago's underworld. Paxton opened his mouth to say more, then stopped. He looked at his brother, and something in Vincent's face made him fall silent. It wasn't the familiar coldness. It was something warmer, stronger. Something Paxton hadn't seen in his brother in 5 years. Vincent had said, "anyone I care about." Care. That word hadn't existed in Vincent Drago's vocabulary since the Sunday morning of the bomb. Paxton looked at his brother for a long moment, then let his arms fall and loosened his shoulders. "I don't recognize you anymore," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer a criticism, almost an exhausted observation from a man watching something change in front of him that he couldn't control. Vincent didn't answer. He looked out the study window, where snow was drifting lightly through the fading afternoon, and somewhere above, he could hear Lydia laughing softly with Pearl in the kitchen, mixed with the sound of Nero's claws tapping across the wooden floor, and he knew Paxton was right. He didn't recognize himself anymore either. But for the first time in 5 years, that didn't frighten him. Courtroom 7, Cook County Family Court, Tuesday morning. Lydia Brennan sat in the front row, her back straight, both hands resting on her lap, all 10 fingers laced together to hide the fact that they were shaking. She was wearing a white blouse and black slacks that Pearl had bought for her the day before, simple, clean, and properly fitted. The first time in nearly a year that she had worn clothes that hadn't come out of a donation bin. Her hair was brushed neatly back, and though her face was still thin, some color had returned to it. 3 weeks of regular meals in the Lincoln Park mansion had pulled her back from the edge, but the hospital bracelet was still there, on her left wrist, the worn white plastic peeking out beneath the cuff of her blouse. She hadn't taken it off. She wouldn't take it off until Rosalie was back in her arms. Attorney Margaret Chen sat beside Lydia, a thick file arranged neatly on the table in front of her, her fountain pen lying parallel to the edge of the papers. She had prepared thoroughly. Residential address. Yes, the Lincoln Park mansion, with a lawful room rental agreement Vincent had arranged, so that, on paper, Lydia was the official tenant. Income. Yes, an employment contract at Rosso Restaurant. 3 weeks of pay stubs, tax records. Environmental supervisor. Yes, Pearl, in the role of the person overseeing the living conditions, with a sworn notarized statement already signed. Everything was proper. Everything was legal. Everything was clean. Judge Whitmore entered, a silver-haired man with a stern face, though the eyes behind his thick glasses showed that he had seen enough broken families not to judge by appearances alone. He sat down, opened the file, and the hearing began. The first 10 minutes followed the normal procedure. Chen presented Lydia's current situation, the conditions she had already met, and asked the court to grant temporary custody. Judge Whitmore gave a slight nod, made notes, and asked a few questions about working hours and income. Then the courtroom door opened. Troy Felton walked in, wearing a wrinkled shirt that had clearly been pressed with effort, but not successfully, accompanied by some cheap lawyer he had found somewhere, carrying far more confidence than he had any right to. Lydia saw him, and everything inside her went cold and still, her hands clenched beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. But she didn't shrink back, didn't curl in on herself, didn't lower her eyes. She stared straight ahead at the wood of the judge's bench and held herself there. Troy's lawyer began. My client, Troy Felton, is listed on baby Rosalie Brennan's birth certificate as her biological father. He has legal rights, and he intends to exercise those rights. He objects to custody being granted to the child's mother on the grounds that Miss Brennan is unable to provide a stable environment. Chen immediately pushed back, presenting evidence that Troy had signed the birth certificate during a period when Lydia was being controlled and abused, that he had a record of domestic violence, and that he was currently out on parole. Judge Whitmore listened and took notes. Then Troy's lawyer was given permission to question Lydia, and he went straight for the deepest wound. Miss Brennan, isn't it true that you lived on the streets for the past 8 months? Lydia gave a small nod. Isn't it true that during that time, you had no income, no housing, and no ability to care for a child? Chen objected, but the judge allowed the question. Lydia answered in a low voice. Yes. Then the lawyer turned to the judge, his voice coated in false sympathy, and delivered the next line while looking straight at Lydia. Your Honor, the fact is simple. She couldn't even keep a roof over that baby's head. The courtroom fell silent. Lydia felt the sentence hit her like a fist to the center of her chest. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. She hadn't been able to keep a roof over her child's head. That was the truth she had lived with every day, every night, every time she stood outside the fence at St. Margaret's and looked in. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes dropped to the table, and for 1 second, she almost folded. Then she felt the hard plastic of the hospital bracelet pressing against the skin of her wrist, and she looked down. Rosalie Brennan, her daughter's name, printed on white plastic now yellowed with time, clinging to her through rain, through snow, through hunger, through cold, through nights on concrete, through everything. She had never taken it off. Not once. Lydia lifted her head. She looked straight at Judge Whitmore and spoke. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge nodded. Lydia stood up. Her legs were trembling, but they held. Her voice was shaking, but every word came out clear, not shouted, not cried, only the truth spoken by someone who had lived through it. I slept on concrete so my daughter could have the last blanket. I starved so she could eat. I didn't lose her because I didn't love her. I lost her because I had nothing. But I never stopped coming back. The courtroom went completely silent. The clerk stopped typing. Troy's lawyer looked down at the table. Even when I had nowhere to go, I walked 4 miles every week to stand outside that orphanage and look at the window where I thought my daughter was sleeping. I never missed a week. Not once. Lydia looked down at the bracelet. I've been wearing this bracelet since the day they took her from me. It has her name on it. I wear it so I never forget the promise I made to her, that I would come back. She looked at the judge again. I'm here now. I have an address. I have a job. I have a place for her. And I am asking you to let me keep my promise. Then she sat down. Her hands were still shaking, but her back was straight. In the back row, Vincent Drago sat in silence. He had been there from the beginning of the hearing, in a dark suit, not saying a word, not drawing attention to himself. But before the hearing began, Margaret Chen had submitted a thick packet to the court, one Henley had compiled over the previous 2 weeks. Police records from the 3 times Troy had been arrested for assault. Photographs of Lydia's injuries from hospital records, the bruises on her wrists, the split in her lip, the swelling around her eye, witness statements from former neighbors in the West Garfield Park apartment building, and 2 violations of the no-contact order by Troy, including the night he came pounding on the door of the Lincoln Park mansion. Judge Whitmore read every page. Then he looked at Troy Felton, looked at Lydia Brennan, and issued his ruling. The court grants temporary custody to Lydia Brennan, effective immediately. Troy Felton is prohibited from making contact with either mother or child. The formal hearing for permanent custody will be scheduled within 90 days. Troy shot to his feet, his face red, his mouth opening as if to shout, but his eyes swept across the courtroom, found Vincent Drago's eyes in the back row, and he remembered the 7 words spoken on the mansion steps that night. He sat back down, grinding his teeth, and said nothing more. Lydia remained seated. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She only looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, laid her finger over the printed letters of her daughter's name, and whispered so softly that only she could hear it. I'm coming, baby. They left the Cook County Courthouse close to noon. The sky was gray, the wind was cold, but the snow had stopped, and the wet pavement gleamed beneath the blurred light of winter. Lydia stepped out of the courthouse beside Margaret Chen, with Vincent behind them and Paxton at his side, while Henley had already driven around to the front to pick them up. Normal. Everything looked normal, but Vincent wasn't. From the moment he stepped out of the courtroom, he had noticed it. The black sedan parked across the street when they entered the courthouse was gone. In its place, 3 heavy black SUVs were scattered along the block, one at the top of the street, one at the far end, and one directly across from the courthouse gate. Their engines were running, exhaust drifting into the cold air. A formation. Vincent recognized it immediately. He placed a hand against Lydia's back, light but firm, guiding her toward the Bentley Henley had just pulled to the curb. Move! Lydia heard the urgency in his voice, and quickened her pace without asking why. She'd lived long enough in this world to know when not to ask questions. But they didn't make it in time. The SUV across from the courthouse lunged forward and cut sharply across the road right in front of the Bentley. The other 2 blocked both ends of the street. Car doors opened. 6 men stepped out, wearing thick coats, hands hidden in their pockets, moving with the posture of men paid to create trouble. And from the middle SUV, the rear window lowered. Grant Caruso sat inside, wearing a gray suit, his hair slicked back, the face of a man long accustomed to sitting in the back, while other people bled for him. He looked at Vincent, then at Lydia standing close beside him, then back at Vincent, and smiled. You've gone soft, Drago. A stray dog and a stray girl. His voice carried through the empty street, mild, almost friendly, the kind of voice a man uses when he knows he's holding the upper hand. Used to be. Nothing could touch you. Now look at you. Standing outside family court like a regular citizen, Vincent stood in the middle of the street with Lydia right behind him. He could feel her quick breathing against the back of his neck, and he thought of Marin. Thought of that Sunday morning. Thought of the 10 steps he hadn't crossed in time. This time, he was standing closer. This time, he wouldn't lose anyone else. He pushed Lydia fully behind him, his body becoming a shield between her and Caruso. At that same moment, inside the Bentley, Nero exploded into motion. The dog, who had been sitting in the back seat waiting through the entire hearing, heard the noise, caught the scent of adrenaline in the air, and slammed his jaws against the car door. Once, twice. On the 3rd strike, the door burst open. 130 pounds launched out, 4 paws hitting the wet pavement, and Nero ran straight to Lydia. The dog planted himself in front of her, turned toward Caruso and the men, lowered his head, raised the fur along the back of his neck, and let out a growl so deep and steady it sounded like an engine. A repetition. A perfect repetition. The image from that first night beneath the I-90 overpass, the dog standing between the girl and the world, refusing to move, refusing to let anyone come near. Caruso looked at the dog, then gave a faint smile. Cute. Then he looked back at Vincent, and the smile vanished. You should have killed me when you had the chance, Drago. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Again, Vincent felt something cold and familiar move down his spine. Rage. Old, deep, black. The rage of 5 years of loss, of 1,000 nights staring at an empty crib, of the explosion still echoing in his ears every time he closed his eyes. His hand moved to the gun beneath his suit jacket. The man deserved to die. He had deserved to die 5 years earlier. But then Vincent felt something else. Light, warm, right behind him. Lydia's hand had caught the back of his suit jacket. Not pulling, not holding him back, just holding on. The way Rosalie had once wrapped her fingers around Lydia's hand on that last night. The way Leo had once wrapped his fingers around Vincent's on that Sunday morning, and Vincent remembered why he had chosen another path. He drew his gun, but he didn't aim at Caruso. He aimed low and fired. The bullet tore through the front tire of Caruso's SUV. The blast cracked across the street. The vehicle dropped and tilted sharply to one side. Caruso's men jerked in shock, a few of them drawing weapons. But before they could react, the scream of tires came from behind them. 2 more black SUVs tore in from both ends of the street, but they didn't belong to Caruso. Paxton stepped out of the first one, followed by 8 men from the Drago family, fully armed, spreading into a line that cut off any way out. Caruso was surrounded. His men looked around, understood the board in an instant, and one by one lowered their weapons. Caruso stared at the scene, and for the first time his face lost its confidence. He reached for the gun inside his suit jacket, but before the barrel could rise, sirens split the air from the far end of the street. Black vehicles with flashing red and blue lights, 3 of them, came in at a speed that didn't belong to city police. FBI. Agent Dwyer stepped out of the lead vehicle, body armor over his suit, followed by more than a dozen federal agents. The deal had been activated. Dwyer walked straight to the SUV with the ruined tire, opened the door, and read Grant Caruso his rights. Federal charges: RICO, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder. The list went on so long that Caruso stopped listening halfway through. As the agents cuffed him and led him toward the car, Caruso looked back over his shoulder and gave Vincent one last look. His eyes were full of hatred, but also understanding. He knew exactly who had handed the evidence to the FBI. He knew, but he couldn't prove it, and that knowledge would eat at him for the rest of his life in prison. Vincent stood still, watching the FBI vehicle carry Caruso away until it disappeared at the end of the street. Then he lowered his gun, let out a breath, and turned around. Lydia was standing behind Nero, one hand still gripping the fur at the dog's back, her eyes wide but not panicked. She looked at him, looked at the gun in his hand, looked at the SUV with the blown tire, looked at the street now empty again. "You didn't kill him," she said. Not a question, an observation. "No," Vincent answered. "Why?" He looked at her hand still resting on Nero's back, looked at the hospital bracelet peeking out beneath the cuff of her white shirt, and remembered the night she had draped a blanket over his shoulders beside the fire, remembered her hand brushing his shoulder for only a second, remembered the warmth he had thought himself no longer capable of feeling. "Because you made me remember there's another way." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. The cold wind moved through the street outside Family Court, stirring her hair, stirring the edge of Vincent's jacket. Nero stood between them, his tail wagging softly, as if the dog knew that something had just ended, and something else had just begun. The next morning, Lydia woke before dawn. She lay still on the bed in the dark, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in 8 months, what woke her wasn't a nightmare, but hope. Today she was going to bring Rosalie home. She sat up, her feet touching the warm wooden floor, and looked down at the hospital bracelet on her left wrist. Rosalie Brennan. She had looked at those words thousands of times, on sidewalks, beneath awnings, in shelters, under bridges. Every time she looked at them, they had been a wound. Today, they were about to become something else. She bathed, then put on the same clothes she had worn the day before, the white blouse, the black slacks, the only outfit that made her feel worthy of standing in front of her daughter. Pearl had already left breakfast on the kitchen table, but Lydia couldn't eat. Her stomach was twisted tight, not from hunger, but from something far bigger coiling inside her chest. She drank half a glass of water, set it down, then stood. Nero was already waiting by the front door, his tail wagging slowly, as if he knew this was a different kind of day. Vincent stood beside the Bentley in the courtyard, wearing a long coat, the keys in his hand. He didn't say anything. He only opened the car door for her. Lydia got in, and Nero jumped onto the back seat beside her. Vincent sat in the front with Henley. The car moved through Chicago in the early morning, past streets just beginning to wake, past intersections where traffic lights blinked through the pale mist. Lydia looked out the window and realized she was traveling along the very same roads she had once walked every week. 4 miles, through rain, through sun, through snow, just to stand outside the fence and look in. Now she was traveling that same road again, but this time, she wouldn't stop at the fence. St. Margaret's appeared around the curve, a 2-story red brick building with a black iron fence around it. A small playground in front, with swings and a slide still damp with morning frost. Lydia looked at the second-floor window. The window she had guessed was the nursery for 8 months, and her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The car stopped at the gate. Lydia put her hand on the door handle, but didn't open it right away. She sat there, breathing, looking at the building, and she was afraid. Not afraid of being turned away. The paperwork was finished. The court order had been signed. Everything was legal. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid that when she saw her daughter, she would shatter into pieces she wouldn't be able to put back together. She was afraid that 8 months had been too long, that Rosalie would look at her with the blank eyes of a child who didn't recognize her own mother. She was afraid of the answer to the question she had asked Vincent that night in the hallway. Vincent turned around from the front seat and looked at her. He didn't say, "You'll be fine." He didn't say, "Don't worry." He only said, "She's waiting for you." Lydia nodded. She opened the car door and stepped out. Her feet touched the curb. The cold wind moved across her, and she walked toward the gate of the children's home, step by step. Not fast, not slow. The walk of someone who had waited for this moment for 243 days. Vincent didn't follow her. He stepped out of the car, stood beside the iron gate, leaned one shoulder against the stone post, and stayed there. Nero sat down at his feet, watching Lydia go inside. He gave her that moment for herself, because this wasn't his moment. Inside, the staff at St. Margaret's had everything prepared. A middle-aged woman led Lydia through the clean hallway, with its scent of milk and laundry soap, past the playroom where toys were stacked neatly on shelves, to the visiting room at the end of the corridor. The door opened, and there, in the arms of a caregiver, sat Rosalie, 12 months old, with wide round eyes, soft hair curling lightly at the ends, chubby cheeks, and 2 tiny hands clutching the ear of a stuffed rabbit. Lydia stopped in the doorway. Her feet wouldn't move another step. Everything she had fought to hold together for 8 months, every wall she had built so she wouldn't collapse on the streets, every night she had lain on concrete whispering her promise, all of it broke apart at once. She dropped to her knees, right there in the doorway, her knees hitting the floor, her arms reaching forward. The caregiver gently lowered Rosalie to the ground. The baby looked at Lydia, those big eyes blinking in confusion, one hand still holding the rabbit's ear. Then Rosalie began to cry. Not the cry of fear, the cry of a child who had just felt something familiar and couldn't name it. Lydia reached out and gathered her daughter into her arms, and when her arms closed around that small body, when she felt Rosalie's warm weight against her chest, that weight she had lost 8 months ago and whose absence she had carried with her every day since, Lydia cried. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't try to stop it. Tears ran down her cheeks, fell into Rosalie's hair, and she held her tighter still, refusing to let go. Rosalie kept crying in her arms. Then Lydia did the only thing she knew how to do. She sang. The old song. The one for which she knew only the melody and a few lines. The song she had sung all through that last night before CPS came. The song she had sung to Rosalie when the baby was only 4 months old and lay in her arms on the floor of that tiny rented room. Lydia's voice trembled, broke on the higher notes, but the melody was still there, and Rosalie stopped crying. Slowly, the sobs grew softer, until only a faint whimper remained. Then even that was gone. The baby laid her head against Lydia's chest, closed her eyes, one hand still clutching the stuffed rabbit's ear, the other reaching up to grip the collar of her mother's shirt. Rosalie remembered. She didn't remember the face, didn't remember the room, didn't remember the nights on the floor, but she remembered the song, her mother's voice. Lydia held her child, rocked her gently, kept singing, tears still falling. But now there was a smile on her lips. She looked down at the hospital bracelet on her left wrist, the name Rosalie Brennan lying right beside her daughter's soft hair, and she understood that from this moment on, the bracelet was no longer a wound. It was proof that she had kept her promise. Outside the gate of St. Margaret's, Vincent Drago stood leaning against the iron post, Nero seated by his leg, the cold wind moving through his hair. He looked through the glass of the ground floor window and saw Lydia on her knees holding the baby, saw her shoulders trembling, saw her mouth moving in song, and the child resting quietly in her mother's arms. Vincent watched that scene, and the corner of his mouth curved, slightly, slowly, almost too faint to notice. But it was there. For the first time in 5 years, Vincent Drago smiled. Nero lifted his head to look at him, his tail giving a soft wag, as if the dog had seen it too. And Vincent stood there, outside the gate, beneath the gray Chicago sky, and waited, because he knew that when Lydia stepped back through that gate with her daughter in her arms, his world would never be the same again. And this time, that didn't frighten him. 6 months later, the Lincoln Park mansion was no longer silent. Laughter had replaced stillness. Tiny footsteps had replaced the sound of leather shoes on hardwood floors, and the house that had once been the cold fortress of a lonely man now carried the breath of something Vincent Drago had thought he'd lost forever. Rosalie, 18 months old, crawled across the living room like a tiny storm. Her little hands gripped the edge of the coffee table and pulled herself upright. She wobbled through a few steps, then toppled onto the rug and burst into laughter, as if falling were the funniest thing in the world. Nero lay beside the fireplace, his massive head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed, but his ears always turning toward wherever the baby moved. Whenever Rosalie crawled over to the dog, her tiny hands grabbed Nero's ears and pulled, twisted, tugged, the dog only blinking slowly and lying still, more patient than any creature on earth. His tail gave the occasional gentle wag whenever Rosalie laughed, as if the 130 pounds of muscle that had once bitten through an intruder's arm had been born only to serve as a pillow for this child. In the kitchen, Lydia stood beside Pearl, the two of them kneading pasta dough together on a countertop dusted with flour. Lydia laughed at something Pearl had just said, a natural, easy laugh, the kind that 8 months on the street had stolen from her, and that was now returning little by little. She had gained weight. Her face was no longer hollow, her eyes were brighter, and her hands moved quickly as she cut the dough into even strands. 3 weeks earlier, the head chef at Rosso had offered her a formal position in the kitchen. The hospital bracelet was still on her wrist, the white plastic now yellowed, the printed words faded, but she still hadn't taken it off. Not because she needed to remind herself anymore, but because it had become something else, no longer a wound, but proof of the road she had traveled. Vincent sat at the dining table in the living room, a work file open in front of him, but he wasn't reading. He was watching Rosalie crawl across the floor, watching Nero lie still while she tugged his ears, listening to Lydia laugh in the kitchen. And he sat there, in his own house, yet felt as though he were somewhere entirely new. Rosalie crawled over to his feet. She looked up at him with those big, round eyes, then lifted both arms toward him, hands open, asking to be picked up. The simplest gesture in the world, the gesture every child makes toward the person they trust. Vincent looked down at those tiny hands reaching for him, and the memory hit without warning. Leo. Sunday morning. The boy lifting his arms, smiling, and Vincent picking him up, the little hand curling around his finger, holding tight, the grip of a 3-year-old who believes his father will never let go. 4 hours later, Leo was gone, and from that day on, Vincent had never picked up another child. 5 years. But Rosalie kept her arms raised, patient, waiting, and Vincent bent down, placed both hands beneath her arms, and lifted her up, light, warm. Rosalie sat on his lap, her little hands reaching up, and one tiny hand curled around his finger, tight, exactly the same feeling, the same tiny grip filled with absolute trust. Vincent closed his eyes for 1 second, only 1 second. Then he opened them, looked down at Rosalie sitting on his lap, her little mouth smiling, her hand wrapped around his finger, and this time, he didn't let go. This time, he held on too. The front door opened. Paxton stepped inside. brushing snow from the shoulders of his coat, then stopped at the entrance to the living room. He took in the scene before him. Nero stretched out beneath the table, tail wagging slowly. Rosalie sitting on Vincent's lap, holding his finger, babbling in the language only an 18-month-old could understand. Lydia's laughter drifting out from the kitchen, mixed with Pearl telling her not to add too much salt to the broth. And Vincent Drago, the man all of Chicago feared, sitting there with his sleeves rolled up, no suit jacket, no gun, smiling at the baby in his lap. Paxton slowly shook his head. "I don't even recognize you anymore." Vincent looked up at his brother. Then he looked across the room toward the kitchen, where Lydia was tilting her head back in laughter with Pearl, flour smudged on her cheek, then looked down at Rosalie on his lap, then at Nero beneath the table, the dog his wife had given him, the dog who had gone missing and found the girl beneath the bridge, the dog who had refused to leave her until Vincent arrived. "Truth is," Vincent said, his voice low, "I didn't save that girl under the bridge." Paxton looked at him, waiting. "She saved something in me that I thought died 5 years ago." Paxton stood there for another moment, looking at his brother, then gave a small nod, the nod of a man who didn't need to hear anything more. He took off his coat, hung it up, and sat down at the table, pouring himself a glass of water as if he belonged here. And maybe he did. That night, after dinner, after Pearl had cleaned up and Paxton had left, after Rosalie had fallen asleep in the crib beside Lydia's bed, Vincent stood by the living room window and looked outside. Cold night. Wind off Lake Michigan, moving through the city, shaking the bare branches in the yard, pushing thin snow across the road. Chicago at night, cold, vast, and indifferent as always. Nero came and sat beside his feet, muzzle resting on the windowsill, looking out with him. Vincent placed a hand on the dog's head, stroked him gently, and remembered that January night, the wind like knives, the Bentley stopping beneath the I-90 overpass. Remembered the giant dog curled around the unconscious girl on the frozen concrete, baring his teeth at his own owner, refusing to move away. Remembered the girl's blue lips, her faint breathing, the hospital bracelet bearing the name of the child she was willing to die to get back to. Remembered the moment he saw that scene and something in his chest, something he had thought had turned to stone on that Sunday morning of the bomb, stirring for the first time. He hadn't known then that his wife's dog would lead him to a second family. He hadn't known that the homeless girl with no shield but a dog in place of one would teach him that real strength doesn't lie in feeling nothing, but in daring to feel again after you've lost everything. And he hadn't known that the tiny child that girl fought to win back would sit on his lap every evening, holding his finger with that small but certain grip, and heal a wound that 5 years of coldness hadn't been able to heal. But Nero knew, maybe from that very first night, when the dog lay down beside the girl on the frozen concrete and refused to leave her, he had known that he wasn't only keeping her alive, he was leading his owner home. And that is our story today. The story of a giant dog curled around a homeless girl in the bitter cold, and the most dangerous man in the city stopping his car. Sometimes in life, the moments that change everything don't come from grand decisions, but from one small act. A coat laid over a stranger's shoulders, a bowl of food divided in two, a promise kept in the cold. And sometimes, the person who saves us isn't the strongest or the richest, but the one who has suffered enough to recognize pain in someone else's eyes. Lydia had nothing, yet she gave away the last thing she had to save a dog. Vincent had everything, yet he was empty inside until a dog led him to that girl. And Nero, the lost dog, found exactly the right person who needed saving on exactly the right night to be saved. Maybe that is the most miraculous thing about life, that even on the coldest night, when you think you've lost everything, there is always someone or something that refuses to abandon you. If this story touched you, please press the like button so we'll know you were here. Share it with someone who needs to hear that hope still exists. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe so you can listen with us to more stories like this every day. We want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever witnessed or lived through a moment when one small act changed everything? Please share in the comments, because sometimes your real stories are even more beautiful than any story we tell. We read every comment, and we truly hope to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for spending time here with us today. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every single day. Love the people around you, because sometimes you are the warm coat someone needs on the coldest night of their life. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.